The BBC News at 6, now on BBC One with Reeta Chakrabarti.
Today at 6, Downing Street says it is providing the NHS with the funding it needs, despite what it calls the unprecedented challenge facing the health service. The scene outside one hospital this new year, 11 ambulances containing patients waiting to be seen. One woman described her ordeal.
I've had 13 hours wait in an ambulance outside A&E because there was no capacity in the A&E, and then another 12 hours in a side room in A&E since then.
Well, we're putting in more funding. We've got more staff, over 34,000 more staff working in the NHS. So there's more nurses, more doctors. We've got an extra 7,500 going into social care.
We'll be looking at the severe strain on the NHS and at whether the government's plan is enough to tackle the problem. Also on the programme. 4 in 5 trains are cancelled at the start of days of industrial action by rail workers due to last until Saturday. Questions about how MI5 dealt with the case of a 15-year-old girl groomed for extremism. She later took her own life. In Brazil, thousands of people line the streets to say farewell to the football legend Pele, who'll be buried in a private ceremony later. And the walrus who's wandered from North Yorkshire to Northumberland, attracting huge crowds on the way.
On BBC London, new year, but the same strike action which rounded off 2022. People have been advised to avoid the rail network for the rest of the week.
Good evening. Downing Street says it is providing the NHS with the funding that it needs, despite what it calls the unprecedented challenges facing the health service. There have been warnings from senior doctors about the pressures on the NHS this winter, with the situation being described as intolerable and unbearable for staff and patients. They say the NHS is on a knife edge and that some accident and emergency units are in a complete state of crisis. Labour says there is a sense of jeopardy that is frightening people across the country. Well, our health editor Hugh Pym has the latest. Hugh.
Yes, Rita, the NHS is always under great pressure at this time of year, but this January even more so. The problem is hospitals are nearly full. Around 94 to 95% of beds were occupied in England for most of December. It was quite similar just before the pandemic, but the big difference now is flu and COVID cases adding to all the other care needs. And there are increasing ambulance delays. This chart shows average response times for Category 2 calls in England, including heart attacks and strokes. They were quite close to the 18-minute target at one stage, but now much closer to 1 hour. And the latest figures don't include London. We've been hearing from patients and paramedics on the front line.
This is my room in A&E where I've been since 2 o'clock this morning.
Annette had bacterial meningitis and after a seizure was blue lighted to hospital. But once there she spent 13 hours in an ambulance and at the time we spoke to her, another 12 waiting in A&E.
It was like a scene from a war movie. There was people sitting on the floor, people on trolleys everywhere. It was just horrendous.
Annette, who's herself a nurse at a different trust, had this message for ministers.
I am really wanting to highlight to this government how dangerous the situation is. And what I would like to do is invite a government minister to come in, even for 6 hours, and to observe what goes on here.
These recent pictures show ambulances stuck outside hospitals waiting to hand over patients, so crews are delayed getting back on the road.
I worked a shift yesterday and I was actually working on a response car. There were virtually no ambulances available, and therefore in a number of cases I had to ask the patients I was with if a family member could put them in a car and get them taken to hospital. It was either a choice of probably a 6 or 8 hour wait for an ambulance to come to them, and that's me having assessed them saying they needed an ambulance, or to do the best to get them into a car and get them off to hospital.
So what do ministers say? It's the same pressures around the UK. The Scottish Government said it was working with health boards to ensure people leave hospital without delay. The Health and Social Care Secretary highlighted the extra money being made available in England.
We're focusing the funding onto the operations backlogs, for example, getting more diagnostic hubs in place, getting the surgical hubs that we're rolling out, getting the backlog from the pandemic reduced. That's been the key priority. That's where we've surged additional funding.
So what are the possible solutions? Some say more money's needed, and there have been calls for a long-term plan to recruit and retain staff. But there are growing demands now for social care to be addressed.
The key thing for me is fixing the social care system, where we have a broken model of providers who are paying their staff too low, don't have career structures, and they're being outcompeted by supermarkets and other employers who can take those staff, and as a consequence we can't get the patients out of hospital. And if we don't fix that for the longer term, we'll be back here having this conversation again in a year's time.
The NHS is under unprecedented strain, but the pressures are not unique to the UK. A combination of flu and other viruses has created problems in some other European health systems. And of course, COVID hasn't gone away. Reeta.
Hugh, thank you. Well, meanwhile, 4 out of 5 trains have been cancelled in the first rail strike of 2023, which is due to last 48 hours. Today, the hospitality industry said that the months of disruption to travel since June are likely to have cost it around £2.5 billion. You can see here the train lines that run on a normal day. They're the grey lines. And here are the services running today in red. There are whole areas of the southwest, Wales and Scotland, which are completely without a rail service. And those trains that are running will be severely disrupted with later start times and earlier finishes. Industrial action is set to continue all week as the ongoing row over pay and conditions means strikes every day until Saturday. Well, our transport correspondent Katie Austin is here to explain what's going on and what hope there is for a resolution. Katie.
Yes, these national strike days have been a regular occurrence for months now, since last June. We have entered a new year, but the industrial action continues. I spoke to commuters at Basingstoke Station in Hampshire this morning.
I usually actually get the train from Alton, so I've had to get like a cab here, because it's the only train running.
Obviously, if I can't get to work, I don't get paid, so...
No, I'm getting the train to Farnborough and then my friend's picking me up from there.
Because there aren't any trains?
Yeah, no trains. But I support the strikes.
So how did we get here? Well, the rail industry faces pressure to cut costs. The government, in effect, took control of the railways during the pandemic, and the industry says changed travel habits have left a hole in its finances. The RMT says the dispute is partly about a pay rise being overdue as the cost of living soars. It also argues job security and working conditions are under threat from changes the rail employers and government say are needed to make the railway sustainable. And those points are interlinked because the rail employers say their pay offers depend on changes to working practices. Now, Network Rail, which looks after the infrastructure, has offered a pay rise and other benefits, but one sticking point is changes aimed at modernising maintenance teams, which the RMT argues would be detrimental. The Rail Delivery Group, which speaks for the train companies, has proposed a pay rise with conditions attached it says will bring the railway up to date. The RMT really disagrees with some, like closing or repurposing ticket offices and expanding driver-only operation. Ultimately, the government does hold the purse strings and sets the parameters for negotiations. Ministers say they are trying to help facilitate a deal, but they still insist it's for the employers and unions to thrash out a settlement. Now, this morning, some of the key players have been out talking. Here's the RMT's Mick Lynch.
All the parties involved know what needs to be done to get a settlement, but the government is blocking that settlement and doing nothing about this dispute, and that needs to change. So I hope Mark Harper and Hugh Merriman, the ministers responsible, can move that forward.
Well, the Transport Secretary said he had ensured a fair and reasonable offer was on the table.
I want to see the RMT back round the table so that we can try and get a good settlement that's fair to the people that work in the industry, but that's also fair to the travelling public and the taxpayer.
The Rail Delivery Group hasn't done interviews today, but Network Rail was asked if its offer would be improved.
I think we made some good progress before in December. I want to keep that progress going, and I'd like to get this resolved quickly.
Thursday's strike is by train drivers. They're in a different union, ASLEV, and their dispute is over pay. More meetings are expected early next week involving all sides, aimed at trying to find a way forward. Without a breakthrough, though, more strikes are very possible in the months ahead. The RMT has a mandate for action up to the end of May. Reeta.
Thank you, Katie. Well, let's speak now to our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young, who's at Westminster for us. Vicky, the railways, the NHS, real entrenched problems for public services. What is the government's response?
Yeah, and I think so. And of course, there are different stresses and strains across different sectors. But whether you're trying to catch a train, get hospital treatment, book a driving test, I think there's a growing perception that things simply aren't working as they should be. And of course, the Conservative Party, having been in power for 12 years, it's very hard for them to avoid blame for at least some of that, even though, of course, some factors are outside of ministers' control. Now, there are short-term issues. The main one facing the government this January are those strikes. But they say those demands for higher pay, those pay settlements are closed and won't be reopened because they don't want to fuel inflation. But I think with the NHS in particular, that's probably the most politically, the most jeopardy really for the government. I think there. People care very passionately about the NHS, and there are longer term issues here about demand, about staffing, about reform of social care, for example. So an awful lot for Rishi Sunak to think about. Only 10 weeks in the job, of course. He says the NHS is a priority, but even some of his own MPs say that he hasn't got long to show that things are improving.
Vicky, many thanks. Vicky Young there. Millions of households on low incomes will receive further cost of living payments starting this spring. The Department for Work and Pensions said that 8 million people receiving benefits and on low incomes will get £900 paid in 3 instalments. Our cost of living correspondent Coletta Smith has the details.
Here at this community centre, like so many across the country, they've been working really hard this last year to help people afford basic living costs. The government gave extra money to people who were on certain types of benefit, like universal credit and tax credits, last year. And today they've made the announcement of who they're helping and how much they're giving for this coming financial year. Anyone on means-tested benefits should receive 3 payments straight into their bank accounts. The first one will be arriving this spring and it will be £301. The next one will be arriving in the autumn of this year, £300. And the final instalment will arrive in spring of 2024. Just like this winter, pensioners are due another £300 next winter, 2023 into 2024. And there's a £150 payment due to anyone with a disability that should be arriving at some point this summer. And as expected, this announcement means that £400 every household has been receiving as a discount on your energy bills looks like it is coming to an end when we get to the end of March. That's exactly the moment that the energy price guarantee goes up by £500, making a typical bill worth £3,000 a year. So the vast majority of households will have to find an extra £900 a year just to cover their energy bills from the start of April.
Correspondent Coletta Smith there. And there is much more on the cost of living crisis, including a section called Tackling It Together on the BBC website. That's at bbc.co.uk/news and also by using the BBC News app. A BBC investigation has raised questions about how the UK deals with children who are involved in extremism. It found that evidence showing the grooming and sexual exploitation of a schoolgirl was handed to MI5 months before she was charged with terror offences. The case against Rhiannon Rudd was later dropped after the Home Office concluded that she was a victim of exploitation. She took her own life in a children's home last year. Daniel De Simone reports.
Rhiannon Rudd was the youngest British girl ever prosecuted as a terrorist, but charges were dropped after the government found she was a victim of exploitation.
She was just a lovely girl. She wasn't horrible in any way.
This is her mother's first interview.
She was just a little bit different.
Age 14, Rhiannon became absorbed by right-wing extremism. Neo-Nazi Christopher Cook, from his home in the US, was grooming and sexually exploiting her over the internet. She met him online. We found Cook was also in contact with a then partner of Rhiannon's mother, an American who'd previously been in a white supremacist gang in the US. The evidence shows he also influenced Rhiannon.
I was checking on her computer because she was spending a lot of time up there.
Rhiannon's mother says she became concerned and contacted the government de-radicalisation scheme Prevent.
She came down and she went, "Mum, I've downloaded a PDF." And I was like, "Okay, what of?" And she went, "How to build a bomb." And I went, "What?" And I went, "You can't do that, Rhi."
Rhiannon was barely involved in Prevent because within weeks she was arrested. As a formal terrorism suspect, the de-radicalisation programme would no longer engage with her. She told police about being exploited. While on bail, she self-harmed and was put in care. She was then charged with terror offences for allegedly possessing weapon-making guides. At that stage, defence lawyers became involved and wanted Rhiannon referred to a specialist government unit here in the Home Office, which considers whether people are victims of trafficking and exploitation under modern slavery laws. The government eventually concluded she was a victim of exploitation. The prosecution was abandoned.
They should have seen her as a victim rather than a terrorist. You know, she's a child, an autistic child. She should have been treated as a child that had been groomed and sexually exploited.
We found the authorities had been passed evidence of what had been happening. An FBI investigation into Chris Cook had seized images and messages showing Rhiannon being exploited. The FBI gave it to the security service MI5 months before Rhiannon was charged. Rhiannon took her own life last year in the private children's home where she was placed.
I called and I spoke to the manager and I said, "There's something wrong. Please watch her. She's going to do something." Next thing I know, I've got 3 police officers standing in my living room telling me that my daughter died by hanging.
Counter-terror investigations involving children are complex. A child can be a victim of exploitation and a threat to others. The lawyer in charge of reviewing terror laws thinks changes are needed in the approach to some children.
You could almost have an injunction, as happens with antisocial behaviour, which would, for example, it would limit your mobile phone use. It might require you to have monitoring software, and that could be done really quickly and keep them out of the criminal justice system altogether.
There will be an inquest into Rhiannon's death.
It's my baby girl in there.
No date has been set, and it could be some time before the case is heard. A government spokesman said MI5 takes its responsibilities to those who may be at risk of harm very seriously, and if it learns someone may be at risk, this will be passed on to the relevant authorities. The other organisations we approached with our findings said they can't comment until the inquest has concluded. Daniel De Simone, BBC News.
The time is 17 minutes past 6. Our top story this evening. Downing Street says it is providing the NHS with the funding it needs, despite what it calls the unprecedented challenge facing the health service. And coming up, we look at why blind and partially sighted people are having to wait years for a guide dog.
And on BBC London, the new measures to try to prevent ambulances being kept waiting outside London's A&Es. And we meet the couple from Walthamstow who slept on their roof to pay for solar panels for their neighbours.
Now, thousands of people have lined the streets to say their final farewells to the footballing legend Pele as his funeral procession made its way through the Brazilian city of Santos. Our South America correspondent Katie Watson is there for us now. Katie.
Well, the family service is taking place behind me. If yesterday at the wake was a day of reflection, today was a day of carnivalesque proportions. People wanting to remember and celebrate Brazil's biggest name and give Pele the best send-off possible.
As the wake drew to a close, the last few people raced to see Pele's coffin and say their final goodbyes.
Pele was a huge soccer player. Here in Brazil, we love soccer. But he was also a huge human being. He supported a hospital in our city called Hospital Pequeno Príncipe. He donated a lot of money to research, and that's why we are here today.
It's the
Brazilian most known person around the world. Pele is money, How many times I got in places in the United States and stuff just because I was Brazilian, just because people knew Pele.
Teofilo was the first in line yesterday, and he was queuing again to say another goodbye.
Pele united us all. He was humble, as well as being the best player in the world. He was a marvellous human being.
And then one high-profile visitor sped through the gates. Lula da Silva's first presidential event since taking power at the weekend. Greeted with cheers and boos, the country's united in mourning, but deeply divided by politics. When it comes to Pele, he's the only man who everyone here loves. And then the party began. What better way than samba to celebrate this Brazilian legend?
This is a day of mourning, but it's also one of celebration too, wanting to send off their king of football, and they're doing it in style.
Pele's coffin paraded through the city of Santos on board the fire engine. Passing by his mother's house, she turned 100 last year. And what a journey that was ahead of the private burial. It's here where Pele will be laid to rest, not a block of flats, a necropolis fit for a king. With an enviable view over his old football stadium, his final wishes honoured. Katie Watson, BBC News in Santos.
The British victims of a mid-air collision between two helicopters on Australia's Gold Coast have been named. 57-year-old Diane Hughes and her 65-year-old husband Ron were from Neston in Cheshire. They got married last year and were on holiday. Their pilot and another passenger also died in Monday's crash, as our correspondent Shaima Khalil reports.
57-year-old Diane and 65-year-old Ron Hughes were on a visit to Australia's Gold Coast when their holiday turned into a disaster. The couple from Cheshire were among the 4 people who died in a helicopter mid-air collision. Back home, they owned a local shop. It will now stay closed. Their friends and neighbours are shocked.
Yes, it is appalling. The more you hear about it, the worse it seems.
I was just talking to him the day before he flew in and he's looking to his holiday.
The pilot of the destroyed helicopter the couple were in was also among those killed. 40-year-old Ashley Jenkinson was one of SeaWorld's helicopter's most experienced pilots. His friends remember him as a big guy with a big heart.
Silent hero, big gentle giant. And what we did with the floods in New South Wales last year is definitely the highlight of my life. And if it wasn't for him, a lot of people wouldn't have got the help that they got down there.
This was the scene after the 2 choppers collided in the air. As many residents and holiday makers looked on, stunned, while others rushed to help.
The one helicopter that was taking off appears its main rotors have collided with the landing helicopter, caused considerable damage to the front section of that helicopter. In the process of that collision, the main rotor blades and gearbox of the helicopter taking off have separated from the aircraft, causing it to tragically crash down onto a sandbar.
The crash took place near the SeaWorld theme park. One of the choppers had the resort's branding on its hull. Locals tell us that the helicopter tours are among the most famous attractions here.
The wreckage of one of the helicopters and the other one were picked up earlier today, and the authorities were finding it challenging to actually remove them because of the tide. And look how close it is to the SeaWorld theme park, a stone throw away, really. Earlier we could hear holidaymakers on the rides.
Investigators are still trying to work out what caused the deadly collision in this popular tourist destination. For now, the tributes continue as families mourn their loved ones, with a community still in shock over the tragedy that hit their shores. Shaima Khalil, BBC News, Queensland.
Let's take a look now at some of the other stories making the news today. A woman who falsely claimed she was trafficked by an Asian grooming gang has been found guilty of perverting the course of justice. Eleanor Williams accused several men of rape and alleged that she'd been beaten, but the jury heard she'd inflicted the wounds herself. The 22-year-old from Barrow-in-Furness in Cumbria will be sentenced in March. The American football star Damar Hamlin is in a critical condition after suffering a cardiac arrest during a primetime US National Football League game. The Buffalo Bills player fell to the ground after colliding with an opponent from the Cincinnati Bengals. And record temperatures in the Alps have left ski resorts facing a shortage of snow. Some resorts in Switzerland have been forced to use artificial snow as temperatures in the country hit 20 degrees Celsius. That's the highest ever temperature recorded north of the Alps in January. Other places have reopened their summer biking trails. Now, during the pandemic, the charity Guide Dogs had to put its breeding programme on hold, and that led to a shortage of volunteers to help train puppies. While now the charity wants to recruit more people to ensure that those who need a guide dog can be matched with one. Average waiting times for a new dog are 15 months, and our correspondent Sean Dilley has been told that he's likely to wait 2 years for his. Here's his report.
You're my little star.
Meet Archie and his puppy raiser Lisa.
Archie, touch!
Archie's getting his head around some things he may need to quit if he's to win a working harness.
You're going to have to learn what this is for.
Lisa's is one of more than 2,000 households raising guide dog puppies. She's getting ready to hand her first, Fergal, in for advanced training.
What are the emotions that are going through your head today?
If I'm honest, I'd say proud. I think that's my biggest one. So proud of what I've done, really proud of him.
Lisa hopes that both of her dogs will give somebody their independence. Waiting times are long though. When my guide dog retired 4 months ago, I was told my likely wait will be 2 years. I've come to the charity's National Breeding Centre to find out why.
Bill's been explaining to me that the waiting lists are currently a bit longer than guide dogs would like them to be for life-changing guide dogs. Purely for research purposes, you understand. I'm going to have to stroke puppies like Bill and many, many other puppies.
Hi, pup. Are you a good puppy? Yes, you are.
During the pandemic, guide dogs stopped their breeding programme for 5 months and lost a third of their puppy raisers. The day has come for Fergal to start his advanced training. That means Lisa must say a painful goodbye.
I want him as upset as little as possible. So there are his toys. There you go, you get a big boy lead now. Bye-bye, sweetheart.
Many guide dog users stay in touch with their puppy raisers, but many do not.
Thanks a lot. You're welcome. I'll ring you tomorrow.
Lisa knows this could be the last time she sees Fergal.
Yeah, I'm fine. It's hard, but you've got to remember why you're doing it.
Guide dogs say they need more volunteers like Lisa to help cut waiting times.
People like us are needed so much to help people like you. The tears are worth it.
Sean Dilley, BBC News.
A walrus who appeared on the Scarborough coast, attracting huge crowds and prompting the cancellation of the town's New Year fireworks, has left his latest stopping point of Blythe. The animal named Thor arrived in the Northumberland harbour at about midday yesterday, where he rested on a pontoon. It's hoped he'll head north to Arctic waters. Danny Savage has the latest.
He's been on a grand tour of the UK. Thor, the wandering walrus, first appeared in Hampshire in the middle of last month. On New Year's Eve, he hauled himself up a slipway in Scarborough, before surfacing again in Blythe in Northumberland. In North Yorkshire, they cancelled Scarborough's fireworks display, so he wasn't disturbed. But Thor didn't really care. He vanished into the North Sea before the festivities were due to start. He didn't disappear for long though. This isn't the sort of thing you usually spot through the rigging of the vessels of the Royal Northumberland Yacht Club. A pontoon in Blythe, nearly 100 miles further north, was a fine resting point.
You travel thousands of miles over the time, because they're all like solitary animals, so they don't need to be anywhere in general. They just prefer just like cruising around. But as it happens, they've come down this area for some reason from the UK.
Today, though, Thor left town. Described as fit and healthy, he's hopefully heading north towards colder waters, although he may turn up again on our coast en route. Danny Savage, BBC News.
Time for a look at the weather now. Here's Ben Rich. It's been a wet one today, Ben.
It certainly has, Rita, and there is more to come. Good evening to you. Yes, many of us have seen some heavy and persistent rain today. This was a scene for a weather watcher in Haverfordwest in the west of Wales. And the jet stream is in quite an active mood this week. The jet stream, the winds high up in the atmosphere, blowing straight across the Atlantic in our direction, steering all these weather systems towards our shores. That means there will be further spells of rain at times, albeit with some drier interludes in between. It will be mild. It will often be windy. We've got all of those elements tonight, actually. Further outbreaks of rain pushing eastwards. Some brisk winds blowing that rain along. Wind gusts of 40 to 50 miles per hour in places. Perhaps some clearer spells working into Northern Ireland, parts of Northern England and Wales as the night wears on. But it's going to be really mild. Perhaps a touch of frost in the far north of Scotland, but elsewhere 7 to 12 degrees. Those are higher than the daytime temperatures we should be seeing at this time of year. Now into tomorrow, there will be some drier weather, certainly drier than it was today, but there'll still be some showers affecting parts of Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, northern England, and perhaps some rain fringing back into the southwest of England later in the day. Again, very mild, 7 degrees for Aberdeen, 14 for Norwich and for London. Now, this little ridge of high pressure here gives a window of slightly drier weather through Wednesday night into the first part of Thursday. But that window will then close as this next weather system approaches Northern Ireland and Western Scotland as we go through the day on Thursday. Some strong winds here late in the day as well, staying a little drier further south and east. Still, as you can see, it is very mild. And then for the end of the week, perhaps another window of drier weather on Friday. Not completely dry, but not as much rain. But there will be more wet weather at times through the weekend. Rita.
Ben, many thanks. And that is all from us. But the news continues on BBC One, as now it's time to join our colleagues across the nations and regions for the news where you are. Bye-bye.